Welcome back to Miss Ewing TV. Today you're going to be able to use watercolor paints if you want. So here's just a little example that I made, but I'm going to show you a couple different techniques and just tell you a few things that are important to know about watercolors. Alright, so here's my paper. I'm just going to use drawing paper, but I also have watercolor paper which is a little bit thicker and has a little bit of texture and is more absorbent. But drawing paper works pretty well. You'll notice it does kind of wrinkle up if you get it too wet. So if you would prefer to use watercolor paper, let me know and I can get some out for you. And I made that painting kind of like a geode. If you've ever seen a geode, it's those rocks that have the crystals inside. So that's kind of what inspired this painting. All right, so watercolor paints, I have them in these cardboard egg cartons. If you notice, the blue is almost out. So when this runs out, I can pop this one out, throw just this little blue one away, but there's a little bit left still. I can throw this little one away and then I'll pop this one back in. So if yours is completely out, let me know and I can change or give you a new color. All right, and then I also have my water cup. I like to only fill my water cups half full because if I were to accidentally spill, it wouldn't be as big of a mess because it would only be half of the cup of water. So you don't want it to ruin your artwork if you do spill it. And I always put my water cups just above my artwork. And you can share, if the person across from you is painting, you can share your paints in your water cup with the person that sits across from you. All right, and if you notice in my watercolor paints, there is no white paint, there is no black paint, and I've also taken out the brown. The reason there's no white paint is because if you want a lighter value of paint, you just add more water and you let the white of the paper show through. If you want a darker value, you just stir the paint more. The more you stir it, the darker it will get. And just make sure you're always keeping your paintbrush on its tippy toes when you're stirring. You should never smash your paintbrush down in the paint or on your paper or in your water cup. That will give your paintbrush a bad hair day. All right, so I'm going to do something similar to this. I started out with just kind of an organic shape. Organic shape is just like something from nature. And I did a wash first. What a wash is where you paint your paper with water. And while the paper is still wet, so I'm just painting with water inside that shape, while the paper is still wet, you add the color, but your paint should also be very wet. So say I want to use that blue color. I'm going to get that blue nice and wet. The reason that you get your paper wet first is if it's all wet at the same time, it will all dry relatively at the same time, and it makes a nice even coat of paint. It's going to be a light coat of paint because there's a lot of water. When there's more water, it's a lighter value. And if I get some like little puddles and things, your paintbrush works well as a sponge, or you can get a paper towel and kind of blot your artwork. So I'll show you both ways. So if I want to get rid of some of those little dots, I can clean out my paintbrush. And then I just take my fingers and I squeeze the water out of my brush. And now I can just kind of absorb some of that if I want it to be a little bit lighter. This works better if you have like a darker value, but you can scrunch up your paper towel and kind of blot it and it leaves kind of a cool texture also. So that was called a wash. The next thing I'm going to show you is where you paint. You can do wet on wet, but maybe not paint over all of the water. So if I have a stripe of wet paint out here, I'm going to use a medium-sized brush for this next part. I'm going to get, this color right here is blue violet. I have lots of violets here, blue violet, violet, and red violet. If you're wanting to use black or brown, I can get you some out. I do have black and brown. I don't have any white watercolor though. But you can see, I'm just kind of getting it, putting my paint down on the edge. Let me get some more water. And it's just kind of running into that water that I put down on my paper. I like how some areas are a little bit darker, some are a little bit lighter, and it just kind of creates a cool effect. All right, and the next is, so that was wet on wet, and it just kind of lets it run. The wet on dry is another technique, so I'm going to try this red violet, gently stirring it. Maybe I'll put red violet over top of my blue. So this is kind of wet though still. So it's kind of a wet on wet technique. No, it's not running too bad. I'll try that again on dry paper because that was, my blue was still a little bit wet. You can see where it's running a little bit. Maybe I'll do a stripe out here. And you can see the difference between wet on wet and wet on dry. All right. Now, there's also a dry on dry technique. That means you're going to have your paintbrush, and you could use any size you want, very dry. So I'm squeezing the water out of my paintbrush, maybe even drying it with a paper towel. Your paint has to be wet in order to work because watercolor paints are dry until you add water to them. But I could get just a little bit of that dry paint, and you could make some really kind of fine lines. All right, and then one of my favorite things with watercolors is just kind of blending with water without even using any extra paint. So I'm just going to have water on my paintbrush. I'm going to take this line that I did here, and I'm going to try to blend that into that violet. So sometimes water is my favorite thing to paint with when I'm painting with watercolor paints. Just all kinds of cool things that you can do with it. I love how it's kind of like pulling up and swirling right there. There is also a technique where you can sprinkle salt on your watercolor paints. I need to bring some salt in. I don't have any with me today. Maybe I'll put some blue inside of here. I just love how they bleed into each other. Maybe I want some blue in this space. Get some water. All right, maybe I'll do some this is starting to dry. Just like those rings that you see in those geodes. The salt is a good thing to use on a geode painting because it gives that kind of like rocky texture. Just remember to clean out your brush before you choose a new color. And at the end of class, make sure everything is put back in its correct space, and always put the paintbrush bristles pointing up.